Cool. All right, so for those who have the footage, if you open up the folder, the Resolve demo folder, you'll see these three folders here. We'll go into the Premiere. I'll talk about exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go through the whole process of basically once your film is cut, once the picture is locked, once you're done editing, how do you then bring that film into DaVinci Resolve and then color grade it and then either finish it in DaVinci or bring it back to Premiere if you're not quite done in Premiere, adding titles, etc. So we're going to go through that workflow, and before we bring it back to Premiere, before we finish, I'll show how to actually do some basic color grading in Resolve and how some of that works. So we'll start in Premiere, and then I'll show you how to export stuff out of Premiere and then go bring it into DaVinci, and then we'll go through that. So if you go into the Premiere folder, you'll see a Premiere project. So if you open that up, there's a few sequences in here that we can get started on. Actually, no, that's fine. Okay, so we're in a blank project minus these sequences. So if you open up the MC locked sequence, this is a sequence that, whoa. Hold on, let me just set the audio to go out the speakers. Cool. So this whole project is based off of something that I made a couple years ago. This is for my uncle owns a vet practice, and he had me make a video for them. So this is basically a really poorly cut down version of that final video that I made. I just chopped some pieces out so it would be shorter, so it wouldn't be too big. So this is basically the final locked picture, and this is, you know, I mean, as organized as can be. But there's, you know, there's adjustment layers, there's titles, there's effects on a bunch of the clips. There's a whole bunch of things in here that we kind of need to refine and sort of crunch down so that we can simplify the sequence. So in order to get this timeline reassembled inside of DaVinci Resolve, we have to basically simplify it, and then we're going to create what's called an XML file, which is basically a file that contains all the information about that timeline, basically what order the clips on, how long the clips are, and all that kind of information. And the XML file doesn't support things like titles or adjustment layers or anything like that. So if you have anything like that inside of your timeline, that won't carry over in the XML file, so it won't translate into Premiere, and you'll get a bunch of errors and it'll yell at you and it'll be scary. So basically we're going to create a new version of this final locked timeline and strip away everything that we don't need and just focus on the footage. So I have already conveniently done that for you. So if you go to the MC locked finished or for color sequence, this is the exact same sequence, but it's just the video. So this is just the video clips themselves, and we don't need, it doesn't have any of the titles or any of the audio or anything. So just this timeline here is what we'll be sending to Resolve. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
How do you simplify it?
I was about to go into that.
Cool.
But good question. So in order to simplify it, there's a few things that you kind of want to do as just kind of best practices to prep your timeline to go to another program. This doesn't apply to Resolve specifically. This applies to if you're sending your sequence to any other program, not just Resolve. You want to make your timeline as simple as possible and make sure everything's organized and make sure that everything can be received properly by the other programs or by the XML. So what you want to do first of all is get all your footage onto as few tracks as possible. You can't always do that, like if you have like crossfades going on multiple layers, or you're using blending modes or things like that, and you need a piece of footage on top of another, that's okay. You can have stuff on multiple tracks, but for the most part you want to keep things on as few tracks as possible. So for this project I was able to get everything down onto one track, so it's just one cut after one cut. There's no dissolves or weird blending modes or anything like that, so I was able to get everything down onto one timeline or one track. So once you have everything down onto one track, you want to go through and make sure that there are no extra effects applied onto your clips. That might sound a little counterintuitive, but so you're allowed to have, if I click on this clip here, and then I go to motion. Actually, let me find another clip that I know is adjusted. Yeah, so this clip. So you see how this clip is, there's a black bar at the top. I shifted this clip down so that it'll be to adjust the composition of it. I know that the end look for this project is going to have letterbox bars on it, so I took those into account when repositioning this footage, so I know that this black bar will be covered up by that letterboxing. So if you go into the motion effects on this, you can see that I shifted the Y position of this clip, so it's a little bit adjusted. Basic effects like this, basically any of these default effects, the motion, the opacity, or the time remapping, any of these effects here will be translated into the XML. The XML file does support things like this, but anything extra, like if you have warp stabilizer on, or basically any other effects from the effects panel here that you put on here, like lumetri, the color effect, anything like that will not be translated over. So if you have effects on here that you want to preserve when you bring your sequence into DaVinci, you have to basically render out just that one clip so that those effects can be baked into the clip so that it stays preserved. And then you have just a static clip that will have no effects on it. So for example, this clip, if we go back to the original locked timeline, this is at 18 seconds. So if we go to 18 seconds here, if we zoom in, we can see that there's a morph cut between these two shots, blending these two interview shots together. That's totally laggy over the connection, but I promise there's a morph cut. And so a morph cut will not be translated over. So regular cross dissolves will be translated over just fine, but this is like a fancy effect, so this will not be translated over in the XML. So this is something that we would want to export out just this section by itself. So if you set the in and out points for just this part, this section here, so from here to here, we'll get rid of, we wouldn't export the titles too, but so we would like turn these off. But you would want to just export this part and then replace this section in the timeline with a newly exported fresh clip that doesn't have any effects applied to it. So you would basically go through your whole timeline, and any morph cuts, any extra color effects, or any effects that you've added that you want to preserve. If you want to remove the effects, yeah. I can go with that, yeah. You would want to, if you wanted to preserve those effects, you would want to export those and bring the clip back in with those effects applied. If you want to remove the effects, like if you just have temporary color correction or any other effects that you don't really want applied when you bring it over, you were just doing something in Premiere or something, you can select multiple clips at once just by dragging or Command A or any other method, and you can right click and say remove attributes, and then you can check all the effects that you want removed. So if you have certain things that you want to keep, you can keep those, and if you have, like, for example, color effects throughout the whole timeline that you don't want, you can remove those all in one fell swoop, which is pretty convenient. So yeah, that would be the next step, is to just go through your whole timeline and just basically bake in any effects that you wanted to keep. And that's what this timeline looks like. So these purple clips here, these are all clips that had effects on them in the original Final Cut that I had rendered out so that those effects are preserved. Are there any questions at all? Yes? Those are carried over from this sequence here. The pink ones are interview clips, interview shots. The light blue ones are B-roll, and these pink ones are adjustment layers and titles and stuff. So that's just carried over. It looks a little messier here because everything's on one track, but yeah. So that corresponds to the previous sequence. So yeah. So once you have all of your clips rendered out, all the effects are preserved. There's nothing too fancy on your shots. Now I think you're ready to export the XML so that you can then bring that file into Resolve, which will tell Resolve all the clips that you have and all the orders that they're in and everything like that. So once you have this sequence prepped for Resolve, you can go up to File, Export, and instead of going to Media like you normally do, you go all the way down to Final Cut Pro XML. And it'll go through this thing, and you pick where you want to save it. I already did this. You should already have an XML file in your folders. So this is already created for you, but you would basically pick where you want to save it, and you would click Save. And what's nice is that if there are any errors when creating the XML, it'll tell you if anything doesn't carry over. So like if you have effects that you left on the clip by accident, or that you purposely left there for whatever reason, it'll tell you what won't be translated into that XML. So it'll also account for titles and things like that. So if you have extra titles in your Premiere project, it'll tell you that those things did not get translated into the XML. So you can go through and you can see all the things that weren't caught in the XML file. But if there isn't anything, it won't give you any pop-ups, it won't give you any errors, and that means that your XML was created successfully, and you are now ready to go into Resolve. Any questions? No. Cool. Okay. So we'll close out of Premiere, and then we'll go into Resolve. And we'll when you open Resolve for the first time, you'll be prompted to create a new project. So you can just double click on this project and it'll open up a new project for you. So intro to Resolve. So basically DaVinci Resolve is primarily a color grading program. It also has other features since the most recent update that allow you to do slightly robust editorial things. They're trying to up the editorial features in Resolve so that you can actually start and finish a project in Resolve itself. Yeah, so you can. They're trying to make it so that you can do pretty much everything in Resolve. So you can import all your footage, you can edit it all in Resolve in the edit section here, and then color grade it and then export it. So you don't need to use any other programs if you were so inclined. So that's a nice feature of Resolve. The way Resolve is organized is it's organized into basically 4 pages. The one that it defaults to first is the media page. This is basically where you import all your footage. This is where you organize it all. This is where you, this is where you would do all the organization for all your footage, and this is where we'll import the XML and things like that. So this is the media page, and this is where you kind of you see all the information about your footage and everything like that. The next panel over is the edit page. This is where you'll create the timeline for your footage. Actually, the XML creates the timeline for you. So this is where you'll have your timeline. This is where you can ensure that your XML was brought into Resolve successfully. So you can, oh, sorry, actually one thing that I forgot to mention was that after you're done creating that prepped sequence in Premiere for Resolve, one thing that you want to do is export a reference movie. And what a reference movie is it's basically a regular QuickTime movie, and you'll use that to check against what you bring into Resolve to make sure that everything you imported was imported successfully. So you have that file as well. If you go to your folders and you go to Exports and then go to Premiere Exports, you'll see a folder for reference movies, and you'll see a reference movie here, and this is what you'll bring into Resolve in addition to the XML to match up your to verify that you imported the XML correctly. There's also reference audio here. This is just for scratch audio so that you can have something to listen to in Resolve, so it's not just dead silent. This is nothing fancy. This is just an export from the Final Cut. So yeah, so where was I? So this is the edit page, and if your picture wasn't locked, like if you're receiving a project from somebody else and you were importing XML here, by importing an XML instead of just getting a bunch of shots, you still have the ability to adjust clips and make other editorial changes, since you're basically rebuilding the timeline in here. So now your project is moved over to here. So if you needed to make other changes, you could slip a shot a couple frames, or make a shot longer or shorter by a couple frames, or things like that. So you can do all of that in the edit page. And then moving over to the next page is the color page. This is where you'll be doing all your color grading. This is where all the tools are hosted for, this is where all your nodes are, all your color wheels to make all your adjustments. You can do keyframed adjustments, and this is where your scopes are. So this is where all of that is hosted. And we'll go over all of the tools and everything eventually, yeah. Say that again? We'll go over that when we get to the actual color grading. Don't worry. And then the next page over is the deliver page. This is where you actually export the project to either be finished, completely finished, or if you're sending it back to the editor or whoever's finishing it, or if you're sending it out to be sound mixed or something, this is where you could do something like that as well. So yeah, so we'll go back to the media page, and we'll start by importing the XML. So if you go up to File, and then go down to Import AAF, EDL, or XML. AAF and EDL are similar to XML. They just don't support as many effects like crossfades and stuff like that. XML is, I guess, the most sophisticated file type that supports the most amount of things to bring your project in. So we use XML. That's the file type of choice for that. So we'll do that, and then we'll navigate to where our XML is. Exports, Premiere Exports, XMLs. And we have this XML file here. And we click Open. And then we're presented with this screen. This allows you to tell Resolve what you want. This allows you to tell Resolve what you want it to take from that XML. So it can grab like the resolution of your footage and any extra project settings. And this is where you'll create the actual timeline from the XML. So generally, you can leave these as is. If you wanted to change the resolution for whatever reason, or you wanted to use your own specific settings, you could uncheck these and set it all yourself. But we're just going to click OK here, because generally these settings are OK. And of course, it's going to say the footage is not found. That's always a nice error to see. So we do have the footage, so we'll just tell it to search where that footage is. Should be in here. No. Cool. All right, so we have all our footage imported, and it automatically switched us over to the Edit tab, so we can begin to conform this properly in Resolve. So if we scroll through this timeline here, this should look exactly the same as that finished timeline that we had in Premiere. And now we can actually go through and start making sure that, and start checking this back against the reference movie to make sure that it imported correctly. So to check it back against the reference movie, we have to go back to the media page and import that reference movie. So we'll go back to the media page, and you can see that this bottom area here has now populated with all that media that we just brought in. So now we have all of that footage in here, and if we go to that folder where we have that reference movie saved, we can then bring these two clips in. And actually, if you go up a folder and then just right-click on this reference folder here, you can say Add Folder and Subfolders into Media Pool and Create Bins, and that'll create its own bin in the Media Pool for us. So that'll make a reference movies folder based off of this folder name and bring these two reference clips in with it. So now what we can do is go back to the Edit page, and then we can take these two clips and just put it right on top of the footage itself, and then we'll bring it back to the beginning, and it should line up perfectly because it's the same sequence that we exported. I'm just going to do Shift-Z to zoom out to the timeline, and it should line up perfectly with the length, so you know that the length is good. And there should be no difference between this upper layer here and the bottom layers. You know, if we turn this on and off, it shouldn't be any different. It does have a slight color difference, but that's due to the compression and the export settings that we have, so you don't have to worry about that. But basically my preferred method of checking this movie against our clips is changing the blending mode on it. So if we go to the inspector up here in the top right, we can change the blending mode. And if we change this to difference, what difference will do is it'll only show the differences between the layers that it's combining. So if that makes sense. So all the pixels that are different, it highlights, and all the pixels that are the same, it keeps black. So theoretically, if you set this to difference and then scrub through your timeline, if it's all black, that means that it was transferred over perfectly and everything looks exactly as it should. And if anything is even one frame off, you'll be able to tell. So if we come to a random shot here, it's mostly black, which is good. There are some slight things. There's like some really dull elements here. That's due to the compression because of the way that, because these are the raw footage files and the reference movie is compressed. So there are very tiny differences between your reference movie and the original footage, but if it looks like this, it's pretty much fine. It would be much more apparent if something was off. So like if this or the previous shot was off by a frame or something, if I just slip this around a little bit, you'll see that it should look completely different. Or yeah, if we shift the reference movie down, it'll look all janky and weird. And that's an indication that something is off and something didn't get translated over properly. Often these things can include things like speed ramps, or sometimes cross dissolves can be a little bit wonky when you bring them over. So you have to go through and make sure that everything was transferred over perfectly. Otherwise, it won't stay true to what the editor sees. It won't stay true to what the director saw last. So you have to make sure that what you have in Resolve is exactly what's in the other programs. Otherwise, nothing will stay consistent and things can get really messy really, really quickly. So are there any questions at all at this point? No. Okay. So what you would want to do now is you would want to scrub through this, the whole thing. You could usually play it back at double speed just to go through it a little bit quicker. And if anything appears errant, it'll be highlighted because of that blending mode. So I know for a fact already that this already came over successfully. I did this before. So you can scrub through and everything should look perfectly black, and that is the indication that everything is okay. So once this process is done, you can then just get rid of the reference movie from your timeline, and now you're ready to go to the color page and actually start color grading. So also something that you can do at this point is just bring the reference audio in, just so you have some audio to listen to while you color grade, so it's not just silent. This is optional, that you don't have to do this step. So then once you have that done, you can then switch over to the color page, and now here's where you can actually start the actual color grading of your project. So, introduction to the color page. This is usually where you spend the most time in your project. There's lots of different sections to this page, and I'll just go through them briefly. I'll just go counterclockwise. So starting in 12 o'clock, I guess you could call it here, right here, this is your program monitor, like in Premiere. This is where your actual movie gets played. You use this monitor to scrub through your current shot, play back and pause and rewind and things like that. And this is also where you'll review. I'll go into this later, but this is where you'll review if you're comparing it to another shot, or if you're trying to pull a qualification off a shot. I'll explain what that is later. Don't worry. So you kind of use this as your reference point for judging everything. To the right of that is your node tree. This DaVinci Resolve is a node-based color grading platform, as opposed to being layer-based like Premiere or After Effects or Photoshop or anything like that. Those are all layer-based, so you stack things on top of one another. Resolve is layer-based, Resolve is node-based, so you use nodes instead of layers. So basically, each correction that you do gets its own node, pretty much. So node trees can be as simple as 2 nodes. Node trees can be as complex as 100 nodes. You can kind of use them to your creative advantage. Nodes can be very, very powerful for combining different effects and stuff, and you can stack things on top of each other. Nodes can be very, very powerful. So you always get, the way it works is this little block thingy over here is your input data, and then this one on the right is your output. And then everything in between is where all your color is actually applied. So you start with one node, and this is what you build your color correction off of that. So that's your node tree. I'll show how adding different nodes works when we actually go into the color correction. And then below that is your timeline. you can actually enable a real timeline up here. Oh, there's a lot of extra tracks. Hold on, let me just delete those. So this is, you can actually have a real timeline in here to scrub through your footage really quickly. I think this is off by default. I'm not sure, but you can turn it on and off up here, as well as a bunch of other things if you click on these buttons at the top. So these are your clips. These are all the shots in your movie, one after another, and this is where you see your whole show, pretty much, or whatever you're working on, laid out in front of you. So you can jump to different shots. You can group different shots. You can select multiple and add them to groups. If you wanted to organize yourself that way, a lot of colorists do that. So that's basically just where you scrub through your footage. And then the bottom half of the screen here is where all the tools are. So working left to right, on a bigger screen, these would be organized slightly differently, but they're all kind of mushed together because I'm on a small screen here. So all the way on the left is your camera raw. If you were working with footage from a RED camera or an Alexa camera or something like that, not like a DSLR or anything like that, you could adjust the raw metadata of that shot, things like white balance and exposure and things like that. But most projects, I think, especially in the park school, you will be using not raw footage. So you mostly don't have to worry about that. The next tab over, if you have a color chart in your shot, this is a way to kind of calibrate that shot so it looks correct based on that color chart. Again, that's only used in specific circumstances, but this is where you would do that if you had a color chart in your shot. It's basically like a little card that has a bunch of swatches on it, and you align these swatches here with the swatches in the shot, and then you tell it to match to that, and that's how that works. The next one over is the color wheels. These are one of the most used features in the color page. This is where you would do kind of the primary corrections. These are your lift and gamma and gain, and this basically corresponds to the shadows, midtones, and highlights of your image. And then the one on all the way on the right here is your offset. The offset is different from these three on the left because it shifts the entire image at once. Instead of adjusting one section like the highlights or the shadows, it adjusts everything at once. So it's really good for doing kind of global color adjustments to whatever shot you're working on. And then these below here, these kind of dials, I guess you could call them, these affect the luminance of your shot, basically the brightness of whatever section you're working on. So you basically get a different one for each section of your image. So you can affect the color of your lift or your shadows, and you can also affect the luminance of your shadows with this one, and then the midtones and the highlights. And within this color tab here, you have basically different methods of affecting these primary corrections. If you click on these other dots, everything can get split up, or you can get very, very, very specific with what correction that you want to do. So this is the same thing pretty much, it's just split up by channel. So you have the red, green, and blue for each shadow, midtone, and highlight. So you can get really, really specific, and you can even dial in exact numbers if you wanted. And then the next tab over, this switches to the log grading, which is kind of, it's sort of a carryover, or not a carryover, but it's how you would color correct in a more film style. Is Shana nodding her head or not? What? Okay. So if you were kind of working more of a film workflow, this is where you would add corrections to sort of in that nature. But a lot of the time, you can use all of these interchangeably. It all depends on personal preference, which one you want to do. None of these are right or wrong to use, but it's all personal preference which ones you want to use. These are generally the most popular primary corrections to use. Any questions? Okay. So moving over to the next tab, this is the RGB mixer. So this is where you can mix the different levels of the red, green, and blue channels in your image. So you can get very specific. So you can reduce the amount of red in your image by dragging these around. The green, and you can get really, really specific. There's a monochrome switch if you want to make all of them even. If you want to make it go black and white. This is a pretty simple section, but I don't really use this one that much. I find that I can get more specific using the other tools, but it's there if you want to use it. The next tab over is not available to us free DaVinci Resolve users. You can really only use this with the paid version of Resolve, but this is where you would do your noise reduction and motion blur and things like that. I don't know how it works because I've never used it because I only use the free version. But if you wanted to do noise reduction, you could. And then next over is your curves. So some of you might know curves from Photoshop or Lightroom or any other color correction. Even in Premiere it has curves. So this is the curves is basically a representation of the luminance of your image going left to right. So all the way on the left, this is your black level down here, and all the way at the top right, you have your white level, your white point. And you can add points along this curve, and you can bend and shift and do various adjustments to get the sort of look that you want. Curves are really, really powerful. Curves have multiple functions. You can use curves to white balance. You can use curves to add certain looks. You can use curves to do almost anything. And what's really cool is that you can do targeted adjustments, so you can only use the red channel, the green channel, the blue channel if you want it to get really specific, or you can link them all together with these. So yeah, so curves are really, really useful. This is just one of the kinds of curves that you can use. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of dots here for different kinds of curves that you can use on your footage. So we'll go through those really quickly. They're all sort of similar. So this is the hue versus hue curve. So if you wanted to change a certain kind of color from one to another, you could add a point along this curve and just affect that area of color. So like if you wanted to make grass not green, but if you wanted to make it blue or something, if there was grass in this shot, you could see it. But this is a direct hue adjustment. Let me see if I can do a blue adjustment for that shot that's there right now. No? Let me try another one, different shot with some color in it. Like this dog here. Let's say we didn't want him to be brown. We could add a point, and then we could make him purple or something. So this is a good way of doing pretty drastic adjustments to your shots if you wanted to adjust something like that. Moving over, you have hue versus saturation. So instead of shifting the hue of a certain color, you can do a targeted saturation adjustment. So if I wanted to, say, make him not brown, but without any color, which is a very sad thing to do to a dog, but you could take the reds or the browns here and just drag that down, and that would desaturate that portion of your image, that color range of your image. And you can make this as wide, or you can get really, really creative with this. This is a very powerful section of the curves, used very frequently. And then moving over, you have hue versus luminance. I've never ever seen this actually used in a real life scenario. It does this similar things to the other two, but it adjusts the luminance of that color. So if you wanted to make something darker, I guess you could do that, but it results in very weird artifacting and stuff like that. It gets really grainy and blocky and gross. So I've never used that, but if you wanted to adjust the luminance of a certain hue, you could. And then the last two are luminance versus saturation. So if you wanted to, for example, saturate just the darker parts of your image, you could add a point here and then bring this up, and that would saturate just the darker parts of your image if you wanted to do that for a certain look. Or just the highlights. You can get creative with all of these. You can add a bunch of points and get really, really specific. And then the last one is saturation versus saturation. So if you wanted to tell, basically, for example, if you had something that was really, really, really saturated in your image, like, I don't know, like a fire truck or something, and it was really, really bright and you wanted to dull that down, you could tell everything. Basically, this is desaturated and saturated, so you could tell everything that's really saturated up here and just bring that down a little bit if you had a really saturated image. That would be one method of dealing with that. So those are the curves. The curves are really, really powerful, and there's a lot that you can do with them. Again, there's no right or wrong way to go about color correcting an image. It's all whatever tools you prefer and whatever personal preference you have. So it's kind of up to you which ones you want to use. Some people would argue that the curves are better for one thing over the primary corrections, or vice versa, but it's all really up to you. And then moving over is another very important tab. This is where you'll do your what's called qualifications. I mentioned that earlier. This is where you would do what's called a secondary correction, so a much more targeted correction. So for example, if I wanted to just affect this blue in her jeans, I could isolate that blue and then add a correction on top of that. So the way this works is it defaults to this color picker here, and you can just click and drag on the monitor here, and that will select. You can see the node updating live as I pull a selection. So you basically make a selection here, and then you can add a correction on top of it. If I click this button, this little magic wand looking thing, this is the highlight button, and this will show me exactly what I have selected in here. And I can use these tools here and these sliders here to refine the selection so I can make it as wide or as specific as I want it. So this looks like a good start to a selection. Let me just hide the stills over here and the clips and the timeline just so I can make it a little bit bigger. So this is a decent selection. It's a little bit noisy in here, so I think I want to get some more of that color in my selection. So I can click the plus in this eyedropper here, and that'll let me add colors to that selection. And that'll allow me to grow the selection. You can see that you start to get some other things in your image as you increase the selection. So it's kind of a push and pull and trial and error to see how you can get the best selection with your eyedroppers and stuff like that. And you can adjust all of these to get more or less specific. You can go nuts with the qualification, but it's all for getting a very, very specific selection in your image. One of the biggest uses of this is to isolate the skin tones if you have a person in your shot. One of the most important things in color correction is making sure that someone's skin tone looks right. So if someone was under fluorescent lights or something, or another light source that was making them look a little bit green or a little bit purple or something, you could isolate their skin tone and then add an adjustment to that and make them look a little bit better. For example, we can go to this shot here, and this whole room, when I was shooting this, is pretty green. You can see the wall back here is kind of this gross yellow-green color, and that's definitely spilling onto his face a little bit. So what we can do is we can add a key to just his face to isolate his skin tones and then make a correction based off of that. So we can just click and drag on his skin, and it looks really terrifying at first, but it's okay, I promise. And then you can refine the selection as much or as little as you want and get exactly what you want. See, that was a little bit too much there, so I'll minus it and dial it back a little bit. It's really a trial and error, push and pull sort of thing. It just takes a lot of finessing to get right. But you can slide these around and get really exactly what you want. And you can mess with all these sliders to smooth or not smooth your thing, and there's a blur on it, so you can smooth that out a lot. So that's like a semi-decent, for our purposes, this is a decent selection. So we can turn off that highlight mode. And so now if you look, let me make this a little bit bigger. You can kind of tell in this node, you can kind of tell in this node, you can see that there's just the selection of his face here. So we are now only adjusting what's not gray in this image, basically. So now that we have a selection, we can go to our primary correction or our curves, whatever color corrector tool we wanted to use, and we can mess with these tools to get exactly the color adjustment that we want. So skin tones usually reside in the midtones of your image, the middle brightness of your shot. So we would go to our gamma, which is our midtones, and if he was too green, we would shift this to the opposite of green, which is magenta, and more towards kind of the red side because people like to look tan. So we could bring it over to the red, to the magenta a little bit over towards the red, yellowy, and we can kind of make him look a little bit better and less influenced by that light, by the wall. And if we turn that off and on, you can kind of see how his skin tone is improved. He looks a little bit less dead. I don't know if you can see it on the projector, but yeah. So a lot of color correction is doing a lot of tiny little adjustments that may seem insignificant, but once they're all put together, it makes a huge difference. And this is just a subtle effect. But yeah, so that's an example of something that you would use a qualification for. I'll just reset that. The next tab over is your window tab. This is where you would add power windows, which are very, very powerful. Power windows it's essentially a mask that you can use to isolate a certain part of the image to get a very targeted adjustment. So you can do circular power windows to just do a circular thing. You can do squares or rectangles. You can draw your own. You can do whatever you want. So these can get very, very specific, and what you can do is you can track them to objects in the frame, so they can follow somebody around. Like if you wanted to just isolate someone's face without using the qualifier, you could use a circular power window around their face and then track it to their face, so it'll follow them wherever they go, which is a very, very common thing to do and very fun thing to do. So like if I could draw a mask around his face, get as specific as I wanted, you can use the highlight to see exactly what you're selected. You just click on the icon here, and that'll add it to your frame. So let's say that was good. It's obviously not perfect, but for our purposes, it's fine. If we had a wild and crazy adjustment to this, let's say we wanted him super orange, we could then go over to the tracker and then track this window to whatever it's on top of. So this is on top of his face, so it'll now go through the footage and track that window to his face. It's going to go super slow on this laptop, but no, does it not want to do it? I love when this happens. Come on, Resolve, you can do it. All right, but it's not working. But basically, it would go through the shot and it would track the mask to the person, and it's really cool when you actually see it in action. But of course, Resolve doesn't want to work right now, so that's that. You can also use the tracker to stabilize your shot. This is similar to Warp Stabilizer in Premiere. You can use this to stabilize shaky footage or something like that. That's also another feature of it. And then moving along, you have blur and sharpen. If you wanted to blur somebody's face, with this one, you could do that. If you wanted to blur somebody's face out or sharpen it a lot, you could do that. These are pretty cool. Like if you're trying to blot out somebody's face in the background or something, you could add a power window on top of that face and then just blur it. And then moving over is the key. This is essentially, I use this section most. It's basically as an opacity filter on your node, whatever node you're on. So this slider here is basically the opacity. So if I slide this all the way down, it decreases it, and eventually it goes to 0 or 1. So that's basically an opacity. That's mostly what I use this tab for. It has other functions too, but I don't really use those. Then the sizing, this is where you can reposition your shots or stretch or whatever you want to do. The 3D is also, this next tab over, the 3D is something that's not available in the free version. It's only available in the paid version, but who actually uses 3D anyway? So. And then the next one over is data burn-in. This is where you can add time code on top of your footage. If you're sending it out to somebody or just giving them a temporary shot or whatever, you can click record time code and that'll put time code on top of your footage here. And there's a whole bunch of other things that you can add if you were so inclined. Okay, so those are the color tools. That's kind of a quick summary of all the ways that you can affect your footage and do color correction and things like that. So those are the color tools. Over here on the right side are 3 other windows. The first one is keyframing. So you can add keyframes to any masks or any other color correction that you wanted to do. This listing here corresponds to the number of nodes in your node tree. So if I had a bunch of nodes here, it would add a corrector layer for every node that I had, but I don't want that many, so I'm going to get rid of those. And you would just click here, and then you could add a keyframe, move along, add another keyframe, make another adjustment, and it would fade between all those. That's keyframing. And then next over is your waveform monitor, or scopes. So here's where you can see all the different scopes. You have your parade, you have your waveform, your vector scope, and your histogram. And these are all basically just different ways of reading the actual data in your image. Scopes are really important because it allows you to see exactly what the data readout from your video is. It can be used to match different shots. It can be used to make sure that your footage is in the legal limit of wherever. Like if you're going to broadcast, it can't be over or below a certain luminance level. So you can use all of these different scopes to judge that. I'll just run through these really quickly. The parade is basically each red, green, and blue. The 3 channels have their own basically luminance readout. So this is 3 sections within this waveform, within this monitor, within this scope, and it's basically a left to right reading of your image. So you can kind of sort of see how this scope matches up with the shot. So this really bright section here is likely this section way at the top over here because this looks really, really bright and almost overexposed, and this section at the top right, this little blip at the top right here is that really, really bright section. So you can kind of see how it matches up with the shots. So this parade is really good for balancing out your shot if you're trying to correct the white balance or add a color cast if you were going for that look in your shot. Right now you can kind of see the shot is pretty green looking, so you can see that the green channel is a little bit higher than the red and the blue, so you can use that to help balance out your shot. So like if I wanted to correct for that green, I could add a little bit of magenta and sort of start to balance out these three channels. The other one is a waveform monitor. This is similar to the RGB Parade, but it's kind of all pushed into one, so you get kind of a bigger, broader view of the luminance of your image. The vector scope, the one below that, this is to read the saturation of your image. So this is basically representative of a color wheel. So you have all these different boxes correspond to different colors. So this one up here is the red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. And this white blip in the middle is the data of your shot. So you can just make that a little bit brighter / bigger. That helps a little bit too. So you can see where, if there's a really strong color in your image, you can see that it would be jutting out in a certain direction, and you could, this can be used to help judge where things are too saturated or not saturated enough, or things like that. So like, for example, this tiny little thing here, you can actually, I think you can zoom. You can't zoom. This tiny little blip here, if you can see that, is likely the whole green cast of the image. It's kind of, or actually no, this is in between the yellow and red. So it's probably his skin tone. If I had to guess, it doesn't look like there's anything else too saturated in that area. It might be this section over here, which looks a little bit yellow. But you can use this to judge the colors in your shot, pretty much. And then the histogram is similar to the waveform. It's just a slightly different way of reading out the luminance in your image. Basically, it reads dark on the left and light on the right side, and you can kind of use this to judge the color balance as well as the luminance of your image. And so yeah, so those are the scopes, and yeah, I think that's a good summary of the color page. Are there any questions about what some of these buttons do, or anything else about the color page? Anything you want me to demo so far? Anything like that? No? Okay. So I'll go through and I'll do some minor color grading. So you would start basically with, like you would any other project, you start from the beginning and work through it all the way until the end. So I'll just zoom this to fit. So basically the way that you would go about color grading is you would first you would evaluate the image. You would just look at it and see what's good about it, what's bad about it, if there's anything that needs fixing, if something doesn't look correct to you. The first step in color grading anything is always to evaluate the image. So the scopes come in handy here. You can use the scopes to judge exactly how overexposed something is, how underexposed something is, and so you use a conjunction of the scopes and your own eyes to judge how good an image is and what you might need to have to do to it. So you could scrub through the shot, see kind of what you're dealing with, and then you can start to make adjustments off of that. So generally the first thing that you do is you do the color correction. So that's usually fixing any bad white balance problems, expanding out the contrast if the shot is really flat. So those kind of fall into the category of color correction. So those are generally the first things that you would want to do. So that's really where these primary wheels come into play. So if the first thing I wanted to do was expand out the contrast a little bit, you can see that the darkest points of the image are kind of hovering around, I don't know, 150 maybe, whatever that value is there. So we might want to bring that down to closer to 0 so it appears a little bit more contrasted. So we could take the lift, which is the shadow portion of our image, and bring that down with this slider here. And you can start to see in your image and in the scopes that the darker parts of your image go closer towards the bottom, which will result in a more contrasted image. And you could do the same thing for the highlights. If this brighter part of your portion is only really topping out at about 768 or so, and you wanted to push that more towards the upper limit, you could take your gain and bring that up. And so now that's one way to expand out the contrast in your shot. That's usually a good first step. You don't always have to expand it out to the very top and the very bottom. It all depends on what look you're going for with your footage. Very often, the peak luminance in your image isn't above 800 or so. It doesn't always have to be maxed out at the top and bottom, which is sometimes a common mistake. That's something that I used to do starting out as well. So once you, I don't know why I did that. So once you have the contrast set and you do some primary corrections, for example, this shot is looking a little bit green, so I might want to add some magenta into it to kind of balance out. I'm looking at the scopes right now and I'm judging basically how even or uneven these three channels are. So I was seeing that the green is a little bit higher than the other two, so I want to try to flatten these out a little bit. So that looks good. Just give us some more room. So that's so that would be a good first step in the color correction process. We did all of this in one node. We wouldn't want to do everything, although we have access to all the tools with every single node. We wouldn't want to do too many corrections within one node. One of the biggest benefits of nodes is that you can separate everything out, so everything gets its own individual node, and you can turn things on and off and connect and disconnect things in with these lines here. So you can get very specific, and you don't want to put everything in one node because if you want to try to undo something later, it's very hard to go back and undo a very specific thing if it's all jammed into one node. So once you have the correction done in one node, you can then add another node. You can do Option S to add another node, or you can go to Nodes, Add Serial Node. A serial node is just a regular standard node that doesn't have anything fancy to it. It's just a regular corrector. So now that you have basically your primary correction done, your initial correction, you can then start to add your look to it, your grade. So for example, if I wanted the shadows to be really blue or something, or really green, I could use this lift here and drag the shadows kind of towards blue-green-ish. And you can see that's starting to get represented in the shadows here, and you can see it in the scopes as well. It all depends on what you're going for with your shot and what your piece is. If this were a horror movie or something, you might want to use the saturation slider down here and kind of desaturate it and make everything sort of blue, green, eerie looking. But if there were a comedy or a romance or something, you might want to emphasize the saturation and make it a little bit more red, pink. So it all depends on what you're going for in your shot. So if I wanted to do sort of a teal and orange sort of correction, I could make the shadows a little bit bluer and then the highlights a little bit warmer, and you can kind of get that color contrast going. This is very emphasized and a little bit extreme, but just so you can see it on the projector. That's kind of an example of a grade that you could do. So then you can, after you do that, you can go as specific or not specific as you want. If you wanted to target certain things, like if you wanted to make this sign out front a little bit brighter, you could add a power window on top of that. You could draw a power window. I'm just going to do a really crappy one for our sake. And you could track it to that. Let's see if it'll work now, maybe. Hey, it works. And so you can track it and it'll stick to that, and you can just do an adjustment on that if you wanted to make the sign brighter or something. So you can get very specific or very not specific depending on what all the corrections you want to do and how crazy you want to go. Stop. Okay. So we'll go to another shot. We'll go to an interview shot, for example, something that appears a lot in the film. So for interview shots, you would kind of want to make the subject look as best as possible. So in addition to correcting any color casts or the initial correction to your footage, you would want to make sure that the subject looks great, obviously, because they're the subject of the shot. So we would start this shot just like we would any other shot. It's pretty flat to start with, so we could expand out the contrast a little bit. And the walls are pretty green, and the whole shot's kind of green, and you can see that here as well, so we'll add some magenta back in there to kind of correct that white balance. Looks like we could add a little bit of blue as well. A very precise way of adjusting white balance is in the curves. If you go to your curves channel here, if you're in the curves and you hover over your monitor here, your cursor will turn into an eyedropper, and you can click, and every time you click, it'll add points on the curve that correspond to where those red, green, and blue values are where you just clicked. So if I were to pick something that should be white, like his coat here, if I were to pick a point on there, you can see that the white balance is actually already pretty good. And if I wanted to make it really perfect, I could single out that dot that it just created and align them all with each other, and you can get a very specific calibrated white balance. And so now it's a little bit more correct. Things look a little bit more natural. If we turn this off and on, you can see just how much that contrast adjustment and that white balance did for our shot. You know, he looks a little bit more alive. It looks just a lot more normal. And just simple corrections, initial corrections like that can bring your footage to a whole other level. So yeah, so once you have your initial correction done, you can start to do other secondary adjustments. So we can add another node, and let's say we wanted to get rid of this really gross green on the wall. We could come to our hue versus saturation curve, and we can, again, our cursor turns into an eyedropper, so we can click on that and that'll add a point on our curve. We can expand it out a little bit so it's a little bit more of a general adjustment, and then we can just dip that down and that'll take all the color out of that wall. So it's a little bit nicer to look at. So you can do very specific adjustments, and a lot. If you do your job right, no one should notice it, which is kind of unfortunate, but it results in a great looking image. So even just this one node, this one correction, changed the entire look of the image, and it looks a little bit more, medical, a little bit more professional. So if we wanted to do another correction separate from that, we could target his face. We can do an actual. Let's do an actual good mask here. Cool. So we'll soften that out a little bit, shrink it a little bit. We'll position it right over his face, so we just get his face here. That's my uncle, in case you were curious. I know you weren't, but. So now that we have that isolated around his face, we can track it so it'll follow his face. Let's see if it works. And it does. So that'll stick right to his face. So any corrections that we do, we don't have to keyframe it manually. It'll just stick right to his face. If we turn off the adjustments, it'll go a little faster. That's good. You don't have to let it finish. Okay, so now you can see the mask is tracked to his face, so wherever he goes, the mask goes. And now we can add a correction on top of that, so I'll just hide that little guide. And now we can make him look a little bit more tan if we wanted. We can give his face some life. We can brighten it up a little bit to make him stand out as the subject. So if we turn that off and on, you can. It's very subtle, but it does make a big difference. It makes your eye go to the subject like a fraction of a second quicker, and that's kind of the goal, what you want with your shots. So even just that tiny adjustment. One thing that's really cool, if we zoom in here, it might not be super apparent. That's not as cool. Great. One thing that you can do, often this works wonders. If you go to this second tab over here on the bottom, this 1 and 2, this MD stands for midtone detail, and if you just reduce the midtone detail, you can soften out somebody's skin. If you turn that off and on, it just kind of softens his skin a little bit. Oops. You can I'll go really extreme so you can see. But it kind of smooths out wrinkles and any zits or anything like that. So that's really fun to do. You just don't want to go too extreme like this, because then he looks not human. Yeah, so you can use tools like this to make somebody look better, or really worse. If you wanted somebody's skin to look really ragged or something, you could jack up the midtone detail and make his face really crunchy looking, depending on whatever look you're going for. Like if it's, I don't know, like a cowboy or something, you might want that. So yeah, and power windows can be used for other things besides just isolating things. One of the most popular things in everything that you see ever is a vignette. So if you just add a really big power window and soften it out, and invert it so it affects the outside, and then just darken that up, that'll add a nice vignette on top of your image. And that makes it look a little bit more cinematic, and depending on what you're going for. So yeah, so with just a few corrections, you can take your image from this, which looks like garbage, and turn it into something nice looking, like that. And now repeat for every other shot in your film.
Is there any way to cascade this out?
Great question. Yes. So that's actually a great segue into the next talking point. So if we go up here to the gallery, you can just click on this to expand it if it's collapsed. You can create stills, which are basically screen captures of whatever shot you're currently working on. So if you right-click on the monitor and click Grab Still, that'll create a screenshot over here, and that'll also capture your entire node tree. So if you right-click on that shot and then go to Display Node Graph, you can see that it saved everything that I had in this node tree, all the corrections, all the nodes, and everything. So you can then, this will save here, so then if you were to go to another shot, for example, another interview shot, you don't want to do all those corrections all over again. That's a waste of time. Who wants to do that? So you can just right-click on this and say Append Node Graph, and now all your corrections will just be pasted right onto there.
Is there tracking space as well?
No, the track does not carry over, unfortunately. That you just have to select it again, and then go to the tracker and click Track Forward. Yes, exactly. So yeah, so you would just have to track it again, but the overall corrections and all the other nodes will come over, and your effects will come over. So yeah, so that's one way to copy and paste effects and stuff like that. You can also, like if we're on the interview shot and then we cut to a B-roll shot and then we cut back, if this had no corrections, you could actually just press the minus key on your keyboard, and that'll take the correction from 2 shots ago, and I'll just paste it right on there. And the equals key does it from the previous shot, and the minus key does it from 2 previous shots. So that can be really useful. And yeah, so like if also you, like for example, I just did this interview shot. So if I wanted to paste that onto all the other interview shots, I could select all the other interview shots in my timeline, and then just right-click, Append Node Graph, and now all those shots are color graded, just like that.
But you can't necessarily do it to the clip at the source level.
What do you mean?
Like it's all from the same interview, right? It's all from the same camera and everything. Right? Isn't that one file that you brought in, or one
Yes.
piece of footage?
Oh, I think I see what you're saying. So there is a feature in Resolve called, I forgot, I think it's called Remote Grades, where it'll do, sorry, I can't see you. It'll ripple that effect off of every instance of that clip in your timeline. So if you do it on one clip, it'll see that clip appears, that file appears in other places in your timeline, and it'll also paste it onto those. I think that's what you're asking, right? Yeah, so you can do that. I'm actually not entirely sure how to use it. I think it's this, but if you switch over to that, it gets rid of all your grades, so you have to switch back to the local grades. I don't know how it works exactly, but that feature is there. Yeah. Any questions at this point about technique or workflow or anything?
How much?
6.8. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So let's say this is all color graded.
Yeah.
We'll just put a correction on here really quick so it looks corrected in some way. We'll just ripple that to all the others. Whoops. Stupid scroll. No, the mouse is not doing what I want it to. I'm just going to go like this. The middle click just doesn't want to work for some reason. Yeah, it's not working. So let's say you color graded your movie, just like that. Yeah, magic.
Thanks. I was going to ask you how long it takes.
Yeah, no, it's like 30 seconds. Like, it's no effort at all. Colorists are way overpaid. So let's say it was graded. Let's say you were done. Once you're finished, everyone, like the director and cinematographer, see it and they're happy with it. Whoever needs to see it sees it and they love it. You go over to the Deliver tab, and here's where you would export your movie. So depending on what kind of production you are, what kind of workflow you're doing, you can either finish what's called finishing in Resolve, where you do the final steps of your post-production process in Resolve. So you would get the sound mix from somebody, you would do the final color correction, you would do all the end titles and everything. You can do that in Resolve, and that's called finishing, quote unquote. Or if you're giving this back to the editor for the editor to do titles or things like that, you can also do that. So there's different workflows for different kinds of things that you're doing. So basically those change the way that you export the movie. So I'll just get rid of the clips so we have some more room here. Bring this down a little bit. So here is where you can, there are a few presets based on, that'll kind of help you, guide you to where you're trying to go. So like if you're sending it back to Premiere for an editor, you can click Premiere XML. And what that will do is basically the same thing that we used to get it into Resolve. So it'll export an XML with the same timeline, and it'll export each clip individually. So every single clip here gets exported individually, so they're all separate shots. And then you can give that back to the editor, and then the editor can import that XML in Premiere like we did in Resolve, and it'll bring in all those color graded shots, and he can put those in a timeline and add titles or whatever. And then the other option, I'll just go back to custom here, is doing single clip. This radio button here determines how you export it. So if I were to do a single clip, that would be like a regular export. You would create like one QuickTime movie or something. So if you were going to single clip, you could change your format, your codec, all that. Like if you're on a YouTube, there's a bunch of YouTube settings, and it would do it all for you. Or you can do your own custom ones. You can do audio settings. You would go to File over here, and you would name your file. Hopefully you're not calling it final, because it's never truly final, because there's always final 1, final 2. So once you have your settings set, you set your in and out points. You can just tell it to do the entire timeline, and then you can add it to the render queue. Oh, I didn't tell it where to save it to. Let's just save it to desktop. And then you would add it to the render queue, and then it creates a job over here. And if you were doing, for example, if you're doing one for YouTube, a higher resolution one for a film festival or something, you could do a whole bunch of different ones and just add a bunch of jobs to the render queue, and it would do it all for you. So it's like Media Encoder within Premiere, if that makes it easier. So you can queue up your jobs and then click Start Render, and then you're exporting, and you're done and away. So then once you have that exported, it's like in a cooking show. I already did it for you. Go to the thing here. No, stop. 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 Did it stop? Did it stop? Let's just quit Resolve, because we don't need it anymore. Sure. Okay, so once you're done, you exported it. Bam, just like that, it's done. You could then go back into Premiere. Wait for your Premiere to open. Go back to that project. And then you would just bring that exported movie back into that timeline. So there's another timeline here called MC Locked Finished. So this is where the movie gets finished. And I brought this shot in to here. And it's just one clip that is the entire movie self-contained with the audio and the titles and everything. And that looks beautiful. Yeah, so the difference is if you had the XML and you were doing the individual clips instead, this wouldn't come in as just one shot. It would come in as cut up shots. Like, it would look like this, but in here instead. That's the only difference. So if you were still not done with editing, you could still then trim shots or add frames or...
Source? Or would it cut it off?
Cut what off?
So, say you had an individual clip that was cut, edited already.
Oh, you're saying with the handles on one side? Yeah, you can tell it, when you export it from Resolve, you can tell it to keep a certain number of frames on each side, depending on, you can also do the same thing when, actually no. Does it? No, I think you can tell it to give it handles on either side. So you can tell it to add a certain number of frames on each side if you were planning on sliding some clips around or something like that. So it's not just the frames that you color graded. You can add some extra on either side if you wanted to still edit even after you're done color grading. And then from here, you would export it as you normally would to YouTube or wherever you're sending it to. And, yep, sorry.
Yahoo!
Yeah, Yahoo, you're done. Now you can get some sleep. So yeah, that's a quick workflow of the round trip. Are there any questions at all about workflow or anything, or no? Yeah. Okay. Sweet. Yes.
So you record this video, right?
Yes.
So where do you post it?
That's a great question, actually. Yeah, we can put it on the Slack. Yeah. We can put it on like private on YouTube or something, or like on Vimeo.
We should make a
And we'll send out the link.
YouTube channel where we can post tutorials.
Yeah.
That's actually a good idea. That's a great idea. So we're gonna do that.
But
So if you-
everything's going through Slack.
Yes.
Right. So I'm gonna stop that. Thank you for reminding me. I completely forgot I was recording.